How do you embrace uncertainty? How can you train yourself to become fearless in the face of the unknown? That's what we're going to talk about today. You're listening to Pure Light, where we explore how you can believe in yourself and be happy with who you are. My name is Eiley. This is episode 138, and I'm delighted to have my first guest ever on this podcast. I'm here with Leo Babauta, creator of Zen Habits. Welcome, Leo.
Wow, I'm the first one ever. What an
You
honor.
are. Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm
thanks for having
stepping,
me.
well, thank you for being here. So I'm stepping into uncertainty with this in a way because this is the first time I'm doing an interview. So speaking
Yeah,
of uncertainty, so this is something that you train in and you help people train in. So
that's right.
what does that mean to train in uncertainty?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe to set up a little bit of context, if that's okay.
Sure.
Um, yeah, so I believe our lives are always filled with uncertainty. We're feeling it all the time. Obviously right now, with the world situation as it is, that's really in our faces. And so it's like very obvious how much anxiety and uncertainty and frustration a lot of us are feeling, or probably everybody. But even when the world isn't like this, we're always feeling some uncertainty about what we should do today, if we're doing things the right way. Like, am I doing enough? Am I good enough? Am I going to succeed? What will people think of me? And then uncertainty about other people as well, besides just ourselves. And so that's just our usual like underlying feeling is uncertainty, and we don't usually recognize it, but it's there, and then we react to it in a number of habitual ways that I think a lot of people will be familiar with. So like procrastination would be a very common one. Being unhappy with something and complaining about it, or lashing out at somebody when you're frustrated with them. um, yeah, beating ourselves up is another one that I know that you work with here in this podcast. A lot of basically just a lot of things that we do are just habitual responses to uncertainty. And there's nothing wrong with any of those responses. They're just like human responses, right? But if we can tune into the uncertainty that is causing them, the underlying feeling that makes us want to like get control is another big one. Get control, or shut down and hide, or run away, exit, quit. These are all very common ones. And so that's kind of the context of it. And what we can do is actually just train to be with the uncertainty, and that underlying feeling of groundlessness. Sometimes it's felt as discomfort and or anxiety, and we can just become present with that. And then it doesn't have to be like such a big deal. We don't have to run to the habitual responses. So that's the context of it. And the we could talk about the training if you'd like, but yeah, that's the context.
Yeah. So basically, in a nutshell, then uncertainty is the trigger. And then
Yeah.
that makes us want to escape that experience and turn towards something
Yeah.
that's more comforting and familiar.
Yeah, and it turns out the human mind does not like uncertainty, and so we're constantly trying to fix things, fix it as in like get it to be in a fixed state, so that we feel like it's under control. We want things to be under control. We can all relate to that of like, I want my life to be serene and peaceful and not chaotic, and everything to be have a routine. And so yeah, that's what we're trying to do, and because that's not how we actually feel, we try and do something about it, is the idea.
Right, right. So we're trying to control things by going to those old patterns and trying to make things in a way that that we're comfortable with, basically.
Yeah, and this was actually when I started Zen Habits. I think it was 2007 was the first year I did it. That was actually what my blog was very much about, was how to get control of your life when you're feeling out of control. So I talked about habits and routines and productivity, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. Those are all very helpful things. Meditation, obviously, exercise. These are great things, but underlying all of that definitely was like this wanting to get my life under control. It was completely out of control, and there's nothing wrong with that either. But yeah, I think that's what we normally do, is try and get everything under control. Um,
Right.
yeah.
That's interesting because I actually remember when my brother sent me one of your blogs. Like I think it was in 2007 or 2008, so very early on. And I don't
Wow.
remember now that it was about control, but it's interesting that that was kind of the starting point for all of this. And
Yeah.
and now it's evolved into this training with uncertainty.
Yeah, and just to be clear, like all of that is actually very helpful stuff. And so if your life is feeling completely out of control, actually think it is helpful to try and get some control. So like I was completely out of control with finances and deeply in debt. Like getting those under control is actually not a bad thing, right? Learning to have routines in the morning and meditating, those are not bad things. But as I continue to work with this, I started to realize personally actually wasn't getting like a full feeling of control. And I'm like, okay, how do I get more control? And so I would just keep doing it until I realized like, actually, there's no way to do this. Like you can't. It's impossible. And so I think that's what actually a lot of people find is they really, really work on it and get good at control. And yet it doesn't give them that feeling that they want of like, I have everything under control. And so that was one thing I realized for myself. But another thing, as we talk about the evolution of my work, is I would help people to try and get control. So I helped them with habits. And there were a lot of people who I would give them these like habit, steps to form a habit. And they wouldn't do it. And I'm like, well, why not? So I dug into it with them. And it turns out that, well, one of them is something that you address really well, which is just a underlying feeling about themselves that they couldn't do this, that there was something wrong with them. And that was driving them to just basically collapse when things got hard or uncertain or uncomfortable. And there was nothing wrong with that either, but I started to work with people around self-compassion. But I also realized that there was this underlying feeling about ourselves, and it was just actually underlying everything, not just about ourselves, but about the world and everybody else. And that was the uncertainty. And so they're very much intertwined as how we feel, our self-doubt and feelings of inadequacy, and our feelings of uncertainty about the world. They're really like the same kind of thing.
Right. Because it's almost like a mirror reflecting back to us how we feel about ourselves, like in terms of how we feel about the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah. And you really dived deep into that, and you're very helpful in that area, and I think that's amazing.
Well,
It's
thank
such an
you.
important area.
It is. Yeah. It's so critical. And it's that shifting that led to so many other shifts in my life, which is why
Wow.
I want to talk about it and put it out there more.
Yeah, that's so powerful, and it's really great when people like you have found that really powerful thing and just speak it out into the world, and in hopes of helping other people. I really love that.
Yeah, I love that too. And actually, speaking of helping other people, so you are on a mission now,
I
right?
am.
Yeah. So
That's
let's
right.
talk about that. What is your
Yeah.
mission?
Yeah, so my mission is well, it stems from this uncertainty training and just how powerful I found it to be for myself, and I found almost liberation. Yeah, I mean, it was liberation is how I would describe it from all of the things that I needed to do before when uncertainty came up, and it really just opened up like the whole world for me. So I can now like go on stage and give a talk when before I would have been like just trapped in my responses to the uncertainty of that, um, and a bunch of other things. That's just one of many examples. So when I found how liberating that was, I'm like, oh, I have to go out and spread this to the world, right? It's like having the gospel, right? I have the good word, and I need to like tell everybody about it. And so I really started working with that, with the uncertainty of like how to do that. So the path of that was a big was actually me working with uncertainty. But the mission is to bring this uncertainty training to people and to help 100 million people change their lives, or help them to change their lives with this. And the number was 1 million when I first started this mission, and then I realized like, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. So let's make it harder. So it's 100 million, and my secret number that I barely ever tell anybody in my head is like 7 billion. So we'll see how that
Wow.
goes.
So every person on the planet.
Yeah, well, there might be a couple left out, but those are the real hard cases. Uh, but
Yeah.
yeah, so like this is like an impossible mission, really. And so there's like this part of us that wants to turn away from the overwhelming uncertainty of taking on something that feels impossible. And we're all up against that. And so our usual response to that is to shut down and say, oh, it's not possible, forget it, I want to do something easy or quit. And so actually giving myself a mission like that is actually part of my training, a big part of my training.
So how do you deal with that in terms of the possibility of failure? Like how does that either show up
Yeah.
for you or how do you embrace that when it comes?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? That's why a lot of people don't do stuff, is because of failure or just looking bad. Like failure itself is not necessarily a problem. It's like how we will feel, or we're going to let people down, or how people will see us, or how we'll see ourselves. Um, so yeah, like the failure represents like incredible uncertainty. And so I just practice with it the same way that I do with any kind of uncertainty about myself, whether I'm going to be able to do this, what people will think about me. Um, and once you start to practice with it, it's like, oh, it's just the same feeling. Like it's not a big deal. And so when you realize that and you get more comfortable with the uncertainty, then the failure itself is not a problem. And even if you look bad, like maybe people will judge me, like that's not such a big deal, right? Because that when people judge you, it's just like it brings a lot of uncertainty in us, and pain, and other kinds of frustration, things like that. But it's really just uncertainty that we feel like, oh, am I okay? Like, do people hate me? Am I loved? And so like all of that uncertainty is completely, like, it makes sense. And it's not a big deal. We can actually just practice with that. So the failure doesn't become a big deal. And in fact, now what I see failure and all uncertainty as is like this great opportunity to learn, to explore, to grow. And so failure, like it's not an endpoint. I think that's one thing that we realize, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's
Yeah,
something you realize too.
well, yeah, it is a portal to growth, and it's funny because
Yeah,
I actually think it's better when we set goals that are impossible in a way because then it stretches us and it forces us to grow and become the
yeah,
person who, at the very least, attempted that thing, even if it doesn't work
yeah,
out.
yeah. So we have to like transform in order to reach that. And even if we don't transform, like you said, the attempt is still good training. And let's say we do get failure and we disappoint ourselves and others, like we get to train with that as well. And so the failure actually was just a great part of the process of training ourselves, and we can get better and better at that until like, oh, actually I can deal with anything that comes my way. And once you have that trust in yourself, like really, like there's nothing impossible, right?
Right. And you're able to welcome anything that comes at you in life, no matter what it is.
Yeah, that's such a big shift, is when you realize like you could welcome uncertainty and discomfort and groundlessness and failure, all of that stuff. Like just welcoming it is like, it's an empowering thing, right? Like it's not just like, oh, I'm going to allow it to be here, but actually embrace it and welcome it and call it in, right? That's
Right.
it's
Yeah.
empowering.
Because then you don't have to rely on your old patterns to get you through. You can just actually go directly towards the thing that is creating the resistance or the fear or the avoidance and
Yeah,
face it.
yeah. And there's a way where we could be in resistance, or fear, and be like, okay, I'm going to grit my teeth and just be with this. And that's still useful if you can do that. But there's another way, which I think is what you just pointed to, which is like you can welcome it and bring it in with this warm kind of feeling of like, oh, yeah, this is actually something that I want, right? Um, and there's another thing, part of that welcoming, that I really love, which is actually you can love uncertainty and resistance and fear and failure. Like just be fully in love with the moment that's full of uncertainty and failure, self-doubt, all of that kind of stuff. You can just love it, and which is like oh yeah, I've really been judging this because it has uncertainty or failure or frustration or whatever it is that that's there. It's like, oh, I've been judging it and not wanting it. And like when I embrace it, it's like, oh, I can actually say I do want what's here in front of me. And that doesn't mean I always want like failure. But it's like it's not a big deal. And actually I can love a moment that has failure in it, the tenderness of that kind of moment. And so then every moment becomes an opportunity to just really love what the world is giving you.
Right. Right. And you have to be open to embrace that. So it's kind of like you choose to open instead of shutting down that experience.
Yeah, choosing to open. Yeah, I think that's a great phrase because it's like I choose it. Because there's a way where we can be like, it's been thrust upon you, and you just have to like submit to it,
Right.
which is not, I mean, that's a bit of a aggressive imagery there, but the idea is like, we can be like, okay, I'll deal with the uncertainty that comes my way. But what you just says, like, I choose to open to it, which is a very empowered like stance, right? Like, oh, I am choosing into this. And when you choose it, you're like, okay, I want this for growth. I want this because I care about people and I care about myself and the world. I want this because I want to like love life as it is. That choosing into it, I think, is such an empowered thing. So I love that you phrased it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I find that a helpful way to look at it because it is empowering as opposed to kind of being forced into it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's so important.
Yeah.
Um, and I think one thing I've been trying to practice is not judge myself when I'm feeling disempowered and like, okay, I'll deal with this, grit my teeth, or just feel like kind of like hunched over Eeyore more mode and just like, okay, like life is like this. Sometimes we're like that, right? And that's okay too. We can be disempowered and still love ourselves.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Yeah. We
but it
can
is
be,
definitely. Oh, go ahead.
well, I
Sorry.
was going to say, we can be okay through all of it, regardless of whether it's empowering or disempowering or positive or negative. We can just be with whatever comes up in that uncertainty.
Yeah. And I think there's something really incredible about choosing an empowered stance towards uncertainty or failure. Um, but it's still loving just like unconditional love. Like, okay, I'm disempowered right now. I still love myself, right? Um, yeah,
Yeah. That's so critical.
yeah.
So, how do you practice with uncertainty? What does that mean? What does that look like?
I love these leading questions because they're great. Because I know you know the answer because you've been training with me too, right? Like
I
we've been training
have.
together.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a great question, and I know this is for anyone listening or watching. So the way that we do it is we drop out of the thoughts about it. So usually what happens, just to kind of give some context, is there's something uncertain, and it's almost like the rug has been yanked out from under your feet. You're like, oh shoot, like, like I'm off balance here, and something is not the way that it's not under control. And so the way that we feel that is just like a little tug on our heart, or it's almost like someone described it like the elevator is dropping out from under your feet, that
That's
kind of
such a,
feeling.
yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
analogy.
Yeah, and it's just like, whoa, like, and then it's just very very brief, and sometimes it's like barely felt, but it's enough of a tug on our heart to cause us to do something. And so the training is what usually happens is we spin around a narrative about it, a story, like, oh, they shouldn't be doing this, all these people out there are doing things the wrong way, and so we try and like have a judgment and like, this is the thing that should be done, that's our fixed way. And then we'll often go and do something, some kind of action, but usually it starts in the head of like, this is how things should be, or why can't they be this way. And so that's totally human and not a wrong thing. But what we do is we drop out of that, because right now when we're in this, we're actually in autopilot. We can't, we're not in control really, um, which is okay. And it's like being in control is not the point, but we're really like, at that point we just go spin out of control for like It could be an hour, it could be a whole day. Some people do it for much longer.
Yeah. Yeah, I know
Yeah.
some people that can get stuck in it for like weeks or months or,
Yeah.
I know I used to like many years ago. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's okay too. Like getting stuck in it. I've been stuck in it definitely for hours and days. Recently it was 9 days. So like it can be a while, and that's okay too. And ideally, if you train with this, you can actually shorten it. So actually during the 9 days, I got out of it over and over, but I just kept going back to it. It was a tough 9 days with that. So that was one of like my strongest narratives. So, and that's okay. So, but what we want to do is actually drop out of that narrative as soon as we notice we're in it. Like, oh yeah, and we get better and better at this, but like, oh yeah, I'm saying all of this stuff about myself or about other people or the situation. And then the training is to drop out of that and into the body. So it's like turning the spotlight of your attention down into the sensations that are in your body. So instead of our thoughts, we're in our body. So we feel maybe there's a tightness in our chest. That's a very common one. Hollowness in the pit of our stomach. There's like a warmth in our throat, like a lump there. It's different for each person, and it might be different from moment to moment or situation to situation. But often it's very much the same kind of thing. So we just drop into there and bring our attention to it, and we're bringing like a gentleness to that attention. And it's not like, oh, I don't like this, I need to get away from it, but it's just like a gentle attention, non-judgmental. So we drop all of our like, this is bad or good. And then the real thing that really helps me in this training is curiosity, which is an amazingly open stance of wanting to know more about this sensation. So it's often curiosity will be like, well, why am I feeling this? And we'll start thinking about all of the causes. But what we want to bring curiosity to is actually the sensation in our body. So for me, like as I'm here sitting here, there might be like a slight amount of muscle tension in the like kind of heart area. And so I'm like, oh, what's that like? Right. And so you might even just notice physical characteristics of it. Like, does it have a temperature? We might even think of it in things like, does it have a color? Now, it doesn't literally have a color, but it could feel like it has a color. Does it have a texture? Is it solid or like a gaseous, misty state? Is it hollow? Is it, like this? Is it metallic? So we can kind of just bring this real curiosity to what it's like. When we're in curiosity, it's a real openness, and it doesn't need to change this. We're just wanting to find out more. And often what helps me is to think of it as like a childlike curiosity. Like, this is the first time I'd ever seen this particular thing. And so I'm just like looking at it like, whoa, like the first time you ever seen a daisy, like, whoa, that's so beautiful or interesting. Or a rock, like, wow, look at the texture of that. So we really just bring that childlike beginner's mind kind of curiosity to the sensation that's in our body. And what you notice is we're no longer caught up in the thoughts. So it's kind of a pattern interrupter where we were caught up in the narrative, which will just spin around. It's like a little spark from the uncertainty in our hearts causes like a little flame, and then we pour kerosene on it, and it just turns into a huge like forest fire, which is probably not the best metaphor here on the West Coast right now of the US, where there's forest fires all over the place. But that's what happens.
Yeah, but it's crazy though how quickly things can really spiral out of control with the mind, and you can get caught up in
Yeah.
that story and really get stuck or in a negative state, or in a way where you really don't know how to move forward.
Yeah. And again, like I'll keep bringing this back, but that is not wrong. And I know you're not saying that, but I just want to make that clear for people listening. Is like, that's not a wrong thing to get caught up in that. It's just what our minds do. Our minds are kind of like story factories, right? They
Right.
will do that. But it isn't always helpful, right? It gets us into this really rigid state or funk, or just feeling bad about ourselves or mad at people. And so then we really are not in like a helpful place. And so dropping out of that into the body really interrupts that and allows us then to practice with it. So one, that's the basic practice, is bringing that curiosity to the bodily sensations. But then we can bring other things. And you mentioned one of them, which is welcoming. Can I welcome this feeling?
Yeah.
Yeah. Another one is, can I be grateful for it? And so like some things that I've brought in for myself is like, oh yeah, well, first of all, I have a body to be able to feel this. That's pretty awesome, right?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
yeah, nice to appreciate that once in a while. Um, I have uncertainty in my life. That means that I have other people in my life that I care about. Because if I didn't have anyone I care about, like, I maybe will never feel frustration with people. Um, I wouldn't care, right? So I wouldn't feel frustrated.
Right.
I have opportunities for growth and learning. And that's, when we create anything in the world, like this podcast, like you are putting yourself into uncertainty. And so this feeling in my body is actually a sign that I'm putting myself intentionally into uncertainty often, where I can then be like, oh yeah, like I'm actually out in the unknown, and that's a courageous act.
Right. Yeah. And it shifts the perspective because I think often that nervous energy that can come up when you step into uncertainty can be perceived as a negative thing. It's like,
Right.
I shouldn't be feeling this. And that's the thing that kind of leads to the shutdown and the negative patterns. But, looking at it in the way where you can welcome it or even appreciate it and have that gratitude for it totally shifts it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's when yeah, like you said, I shouldn't have this. It shouldn't be like this.
Right. Because
That's
there's
a
a
good sign.
judgment. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And so yeah, that welcoming or gratitude, like that's a great perspective shift, right? Where we're not like judging it or trying to get rid of it or needing it to be any different. This is actually, actually a sign that we're doing something courageous, right? Um,
Right.
Often, yeah. Sometimes it's a sign that the world is just in complete chaos, and so it can be challenging to find gratitude for that, right? Um,
Yeah.
so, and we don't always have to be grateful for this feeling of uncertainty, but sometimes I can muster up some gratitude. It's like, oh, the world's in chaos. Oh, like there's a world. That's pretty great. Like I actually love this world. I'm so
Right.
happy it exists. And yes, it's on fire, but that means there are trees on fire. Like I'm so happy there are trees in the world. There are people out there working to put that out. Like I'm so grateful for them. And then we can do the same thing with a pandemic. It's obviously a terrible thing that people are dying from it. And it's really done a lot of damage and caused a lot of fear and difficulty in our lives. But the uncertainty that I'm feeling, I don't have to be grateful for the pandemic. I can, but I can also just be grateful for the uncertainty, because what that means is I care about the world. I care about people in my life who might be in danger. Like that's actually a beautiful thing to feel that.
Right. Because it means that you're not numb. It means that you
Yeah.
actually are able to perceive what your emotional experience is.
Yeah. So like that feeling is really just a sign that we have like a heart that is willing to feel, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that's not a bad thing. It's not always a comfortable thing to have a heart that feels, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be heartbreaking, especially this year, given all the stuff that's happened. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's given us all the opportunity to practice with uncertainty and to really realize how much uncertainty is inherent in life, even though I think before 2020, it was kind of hidden more so in a way.
Yeah. And there can be a way where people might misinterpret this as like, oh, we need to put a positive spin on everything, right? That's not what we're talking about here, either of us. I think it helps to have that kind of fresh perspective from this perspective that we've been in. But like heartbreak is a painful thing, and we can be heartbroken about the world, and some things in the world. We can have they can coexist as having gratitude and heartbreak, and neither one is wrong or better than the other. But like allowing ourselves to be in the bodily sensation of heartbreak is actually a really beautiful practice as well. That's part of this
Right.
too.
Yeah, because I know that
Yeah.
you've said, you can meditate on the people you want to help and feel their pain and use that
Yeah.
as fuel for your uncertainty training.
And I would imagine that that's part of what you do too, because you're out here putting yourself into uncertainty, doing really hard work, 138 episodes. That's like incredible, right? But that's not easy. And so I would imagine that you're not doing this, knowing you, I know you're not doing this for like self-gratification or ego or to, like people think you're great. You are doing this because it breaks your heart that people feel, what they're feeling, what they're going through,
Yeah.
and you know
Yeah.
what it's like very much.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I was very clear on my intentions when I started this podcast. I had a list of probably like about 10 of them. And
Mm-hmm.
it, yeah, some of them were related to my own growth and development, but some of them were also related to the people that
Sure.
that I hope would listen to this. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I wasn't trying to like make it seem like it's anything wrong with doing something for yourself, right? If you want
Yeah.
to
There
grow and
isn't.
develop,
Yeah.
that's great.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I know you that there is a part of you that is heartbroken that people are in the place that they're in when they're
Yeah.
struggling with some of this stuff. And that heartbreak is actually a really beautiful heart opening that any of us who are trying to do something meaningful and helpful in the world can allow ourselves to feel and be like, I'm going to start from the place of heartbreak. It doesn't have to be, again, just like failure. Heartbreak and failure are not the endpoints. They're actually just a part of it. And so we feel the heartbreak. We can start from there and then bring curiosity, bring this loving intention, and then go out and do some good in the world from the place of heartbreak. Can like you imagine like what it'd be like if our world leaders, national leaders of our respective countries, like felt heartbreak, started from that place. Maybe your leader
I
actually
think,
does that.
yeah, I think he does a bit more than yours, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It would definitely be a huge shift.
Yeah. Not just like political leaders, but just like, corporate leaders, people out in the community who we have. I mean, as a defensive mechanism, we shut our hearts down. But imagine if we allow ourselves to let go of that defense and just feel heartbreak and then let that move us to do something in the world.
Right. Because then we're starting from a much more vulnerable place,
Yeah.
with that openness and that, whatever that emotion is, that's kind of like the heartbreak or whatever that may be that we're feeling for the people that we want to help.
Yeah. Yeah. I love having these conversations with someone who's willing to feel heartbreak.
Yeah. Yeah. So, going back to your mission for a second, what
Hmm.
impact do you think that'll have if like everyone starts doing uncertainty training, and whether they're using heartbreak or, something else to kind of feel their actions?
Hmm.
What do you think that'll do for the planet and for everyone on it?
Well, I can only imagine, but what I've seen in myself and people like you who train in this, and I've been doing it for a little while now, so I can see, first of all, it just kind of creates an opening, like some space around the uncertainty where we don't have to immediately take action or do something, one of our habitual patterns. And so creating that spaciousness allows us to do something different than what we normally do. So, putting out a podcast, a blog, a book, all kinds of incredible creative things that people could do, art, music, like that kind of stuff becomes more available and possible if we allow ourselves to be in uncertainty without needing to run or shut down. Um, and people have been doing that obviously for many years, putting themselves into uncertainty. But there's a lot of others who shut themselves off from that. Like, I can't do that. I know so many people who say that I can't do that, or like it's too hard, or I'm too afraid, and so they get stuck. And so all of that stuff, it's still there. It doesn't go away, but it becomes more workable. We don't have to go to those patterns or be stuck in them. And so, more creation becomes possible. And it's not just like creative work. What about, volunteering and doing good in the world? We allow ourselves to open to that, which is filled with uncertainty. Starting up a nonprofit organization, traveling to like a place that has been hit by a hurricane or war or impoverished, Like these are places that are just in need of people who can put themselves into uncertainty, and not need to necessarily shut down. But there's another piece of it, which is there are already people doing that. There are people who are in the middle of this pandemic out there taking care of people, and they feel uncertainty, but they don't know how to take care of that. And so if we can help the caretakers, the people who are doing good in the world, be able to like be more compassionate with the uncertainty. We didn't talk about compassion, but that's another piece that we can bring into the training. Being more compassionate with the uncertainty and the difficulties that they're feeling. It allows the people who are already doing this to not need to be overworked and spiral down into depression and suicidal things. There's a lot of really difficult things when it comes to people who are on the front lines of this kind of stuff. And that's just, so we're just getting started, but yeah, there's a lot more. Like just imagine person to person talking with people you love or your neighbors, and being willing to be with the uncertainty of, you know, how they're responding to you, how they're acting in the world. Our hearts can become more open. We can be more compassionate with other people. These are just some of the things that become available with this kind of training.
Right. Yeah. So more compassion, more creativity, more change, like more good in the world, and
Yeah.
and less of the, I guess, negative impacts of uncertainty in terms of the stress and anxiety that may cause.
Yeah. I mean, it's stress and anxiety will always be around, even if I was like magically successful with my mission.
Yeah.
And so we just become better at like recognizing it and practicing with it and taking care of it. And I think that's so important, is like stress will happen. We don't want our lives to be stress free, but like we can be with that and be compassionate with it and learn to not necessarily react in our habitual ways with it.
Right. Right. And probably
Yeah.
come through it stronger then whenever it does show up.
Yeah. That's the idea of anti-fragility, that I know you're familiar with. Is like the stress comes, it's not a bad thing. The stress can actually, if we can train ourselves with this, actually be used to make ourselves better at dealing with discomfort, putting ourselves out into the world, dealing with stress. And so, yeah, the stress comes in, we train with it, and we actually become stronger. That's instead of, so the usual way is actually it weakens us. It makes us shut down and really become fragile. And then the resilient way, which is amazing, is to become, meditation and health practices really help us to become more resilient. But when we train with this uncertainty, we bring it in and we actually we get stronger from it. And that's the anti-fragile part of it.
Right. Right. So it can strengthen us and help us, just be more able to deal with everything again, basically, everything that comes up.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's, as we like touch on that, being able to more deal with everything, we can then look at every difficulty in our lives, from, procrastination and really hard work that we're facing, overwhelm, frustration with other people complaining about us, grief and loss. And then, every difficulty becomes this opportunity for practice and getting better at it and increasing our capacity to be with difficulty and uncertainty. So when we look at it that way, what we're facing in the world right now in this moment is, well, it's unprecedented in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a lot of ways where it's the same as before, but there's also just this increased intensity of uncertainty, anxiety, and frustration. And that can be a thing that we really don't like, and it can be heartbreaking. But it can also be this great opportunity, like this amazing opportunity to practice. And if we look at it that way, like, oh my God, like the world is giving us something really strong to practice with. This is a rare opportunity. And if we embrace it that way, we can actually become like masters of uncertainty. And so if I could just speak to a couple things around that.
Yeah.
So yeah, looking at the world like that, the world situation like that, this is an opportunity to practice. There's a couple of pieces that are important to talk about. One of them is, if you are in a place that feels very fragile and brittle, that's probably not the place where you can practice with the world's uncertainty.
Right.
Yeah. So at that place, it's important to get support, to do some self-care, and to really nourish yourself. Maybe it's therapy, maybe it's a coach, maybe it's reaching out to
Right.
friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you have to be somewhat stable, I think, before you start stepping into uncertainty intentionally
Yeah. Well,
or
especially
practicing
when
with it.
it's intense,
Right.
right?
Yeah. It's intense
Yeah.
already. Yeah. Yeah. For
Right.
sure.
Yeah. So like we don't, we're not usually in a place, we're not always in a place where we can do this. So the first step is really just self-care and just taking care of yourself so that you can not fall apart and like really get into a bad place. And so really just reaching out for help and taking care of yourself. And once you've gotten, and that's actually an uncertainty practice too, is just really noticing like, oh, I'm just feeling a lot of anxiety here. And I need a way to vent it. I need a way to, you know, uh, just give myself some compassion. So that's really like the first aid kind of step. You need to
Take
put the
care of
oxygen
yourself.
mask on.
Yeah.
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 So do that first. And once you've done that, then you might say, okay, well, now I'm ready, Leo. I'm going to take on the world. And I would say, nope, not yet. Let's pause first. And what I would say is, it's really important to have support. And so, you and I are in a group where we're practicing with this. It doesn't have to be that group. It could be any group,
Right.
community, practice, sangha, yoga community, just a group of friends who are there supporting each other, or having a coach, or a therapist. So just having that support, I think, is really important, because if we open our hearts to uncertainty, like, it can be an overwhelming thing sometimes, especially with the world the way it is. So I would say just make sure you have the right support. So you're in the right place, like emotionally and mentally, and then you have some support, and then you create like an intentional practice around this. So it doesn't have to be like 24 hours a day where you're practicing with uncertainty.
That
Yeah.
would be a lot, I think.
Well, and eventually maybe we'll be like Zen masters and we'll be there, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you recommend for someone who hasn't done this yet as a starting point?
Yeah. Well, again, I would go through those stages. So just notice, are you in a brittle place where you really just need some to take care of yourself? If you're not, so like, you and I today feel like we're in a pretty decent place. Can you make sure you have some support around that? So a practice group, coach, therapist. And then I would say start very small and have some intentional practice sessions. What I actually like to do is practice with meaningful work, because we could practice with anything. You can practice with, exercise or eating, relationships, but meaningful work is like, let's say I want to write a book, or I want to start a nonprofit, right? So that feels very meaningful because you're doing it for something that feels important to you. And so I think that's important, to have a reason to practice with this. If you're just doing it to like for self-improvement, that's not a bad thing, but it's like really just to benefit yourself. When I say just, that's with quotes around it, because benefiting yourself is a great thing, right? It's
Right.
amazing. But when we hit uncertainty, it can hit us hard. And at that point, the thing that feels most beneficial to us is to shut down, and our survival instincts kick in, and we're like, I don't want to do this anymore. Screw it. Like, I'm doing
Yeah.
this for myself to make myself better. Actually, the thing that feels better to me is to not do this, and that's okay too, right? But if you want to train in this, even for like 5 minutes, 2 minutes, just have a reason to train with the discomfort of it, because it can be uncomfortable. So am I doing this for a greater cause, for people who I care about, even just, not, again, just even for your loved ones? It could be for others as well. Maybe it's for the whole world. Maybe it's for 100 million people, right? But you're doing it for something that is bigger than yourself. I find that very helpful. And that's not to downplay yourself. That can be also really helpful too. But having that meaningful work or something bigger is your reason. So you set that intention at the beginning of the session. You can set a timer. Let's say it's 5 minutes. You have some quiet space, and then you just do the thing that you're feeling uncertain about. So let's say you wanted to record to start a YouTube channel. You would like start recording a video just on your screen, and you'd feel the uncertainty, the resistance. And a good sign is like, oh, I want to go check my email, or I want to clean my desk right now, right?
Right. Yeah, those old
Yeah.
patterns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have some symptoms. Writers are very familiar with wanting to clean things.
Yeah, I am. Or wanting to like delete old emails or stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's actually a couple. Those are actually very helpful to notice that, because there's a couple of elements there that are very common. One of them is it's much easier cleaning your kitchen, checking your emails, cleaning out your emails. They're much easier than the thing that you don't want to face, which is uncomfortable and uncertain. That's one element. The other one is actually those things feel like they're getting you more control, right? Like cleaning things. It
Mm,
feels like it gets things under control, right?
right.
Um, yeah, your emails are under control. Great, now I can deal with it.
Right.
And so we have this instinct to get the whole world under control before we can deal with this uncertainty that we're facing. And there's something wise about that, actually. Like having some control is good if we're going to face the uncertainty of recording this YouTube video, right? If your whole life is out of control, trying to take on this YouTube video actually is not a good idea.
Right.
So yeah.
I think it comes back to what you said before about, having that self-care in place, and then also
Mm-hmm.
the support before you kind of start with some intentional practice.
Yeah. So some kind of stability, right?
Yeah.
And there's a balance. So like having some of it is good. So we don't want to be all out of control, and before we take on this challenging practice. But there's another piece of it, which is you're never going to be 100% under control. And so like we just want to get more and more and more, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So actually, because we kind of started with the control piece too, right? Because that's
Yeah.
where Zen habits originally started. So what would you say, like old Leo, pre-Zen habits, before you made all those changes, what was his relationship to uncertainty?
That's such a good question. Okay, let me travel back in time.
Yeah,
Yeah, old Leo was a good person, but
of
he
course. Yeah.
definitely, yeah, he had bad habits. So like he was a smoker, he ate too much, he was overweight, very sedentary, procrastinated a lot, deeply in debt. So like those were all external symptoms of how he dealt with uncertainty. And his life was filled with a lot. So he
Mm,
had 5 kids, sixth one on the way. Um, he was married. He was living in Guam, which is where we're from. And then he was in a job he really didn't like. So there was a lot of uncertainty about himself. And so the way he would deal with that kind of uncertainty was smoke was a big one. Eat was another one. And then really just try and like shut out all of the stuff that he didn't want to deal with was another big one. So procrastination and like I would have medical bills coming in that I couldn't pay, and they were all past due, and I like did not want to deal with them, so I would shove them into a drawer. That
instead of
was
even
like
opening them? Or,
without even I knew
wow.
like I can't pay for this. Like I don't want to deal with that. I'll deal with it
Yeah.
later. So shove it into a drawer, and they just pile up. And of course, I know they're there, so like I'll always still feel really bad about it, but like just not looking at it. That was
Right.
Old Leo's like one of his number one ways. So reach for comfort. So cigarette, junk food, whatever it is, TV. Reaching for those comforts and then pushing away the discomforts, not even looking at them, trying to ignore them. But of course, that doesn't work because like you always feel bad about it.
Right. Yeah. You carry
Yeah.
the weight of that, even because you're not dealing with it.
Yeah. And even the reaching for comfort is like it's a temporary like little pleasure, but like it always just makes you feel worse. And like that, and you're like, screw it, right? So that was old Leo for sure.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how would you describe your relationship with uncertainty now?
Yeah. Well, definitely much improved, much more helpful. Um, I yeah, there's still some of old Leo still here, honestly. Like I still do some of that where I'm trying to avoid it. But what I found now is that first of all, I'm much more compassionate when I am doing that with
Mm.
myself. Yeah, so I might be. I don't smoke, but I still love to eat junk food when it's there in front of me, and so like I'll do that, and I'm like, shoot, like I ate way too much, and I'm feeling terrible, and I'm like, okay, you're feeling bad about yourself, and so just bring some compassion. So that's one. Is I still have some of those responses. They're just kind of like lingering parts of my old operating system, and I'm much more compassionate when that does show up. um, I just try and remind myself that I'm human.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Like we all are. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I'm the only human. Everyone else is perfect.
Yeah. I don't
but
know if that's, yeah, that's hilarious.
but anyway, so I'm much more compassionate, but I'm also much more willing to face some of the stuff. So I might shove things into a drawer for a little bit, not literally, but like I'm just trying to ignore things. But then I'm like, oh yeah, I'm doing that. So I'm much more aware, and then I can be like, and I know that doesn't work. So what happens if I just turn towards it? So just take this out, take this bill out, and look at it. I'm not dealing with the bills so much anymore. But there are things like that where I'm just like, oh, I don't want to face this. Like, oh, let me try turning towards it. So I'm much more willing to face things, and I'm just much more comfortable with that uncertainty, um, and with a much greater awareness that that's what's happening.
Right.
That's really been a huge shift for me. It's just like, oh yeah, that's what's going on. So like, I can work with it rather than um, needing to like run from it.
Right. Yeah. Or shutting down or anything like that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I feel like what you just said kind of summarizes a lot of what you talked about in Fearless Purpose in your book.
Yeah.
Because it really is about the awareness piece, first of all. So noticing when you've gone to some old pattern or behavior that really isn't serving you in the way that you want it to. And then the
Sure.
second piece is the willingness to actually feel what you're feeling and,
Yeah.
like choose a different
Yeah.
action.
Yeah. That willingness um, is so important. And I would say that it's something that we can open up to and train ourselves with, because you could see like old Leo definitely was not willing, right? And it wasn't because like, well, maybe it was some fear there, but it wasn't because he didn't have the capacity to do it. Maybe he wasn't convinced of its benefits. Maybe he didn't realize how destructive this was. Um, but it just wasn't something he was used to. So like now, I'm much more used to turning towards it, and the willingness is just like, oh yeah, actually, it's a trust in myself that I can be with this and be okay. Like it won't
Mm,
necessarily be comfortable. So I think it might have to be developed. Is kind of how I've seen it for myself, and then for other people I've been working with, is like you might not have the willingness to start with. And it's not like you can just magically flip on a switch and be like, oh, I'm completely willing all the time now, right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It takes practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I'm working with you and, figuring out. And yeah, one thing that I'll share about my own experience is I've noticed that the more that I practice facing uncertainty, the more there's definitely challenges that come up. Like I'll find myself
Sure.
sometimes checking my email or whatever else, but I do also notice that sometimes there's a shift that happens, and the thing that was the thing
Mm.
that scares you and that you want to avoid and procrastinate on actually has a draw, and it
Yeah.
becomes there's this magical energy that comes up, and it's like
Wow.
it's something to actually look forward to in a way, even though it is something that has that sense of discomfort.
Yeah. Yeah. I really love that you're calling that out, because there can be, yeah, this sense of like, oh, okay, let me just, rub my hands together and go after this, right? Like we can play with it is another thing that I'll bring. Like, oh, this is like a new area to explore. Like you're an adventurer.
Right.
Um, there's different ways to kind of bring that kind of like, oh, there's something to look forward to here. Um, I actually find it really helpful when I'm doing that kind of thing with other people. So like this podcast would be a good example. Is like, oh, I don't know what will come from this conversation, but I get to play with Eiley, right? I get to explore
Right.
something with her.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it is like an adventure because it's like, ooh, what's going to happen?
yeah. Um, I don't know how much time we have left. There was this story I wanted to share.
Yeah, I have time. Do you have time?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
So um, I did this workshop with a friend, and he invited us to bring our kind of inner child. Like, remember when we were like really blissful and happy when we were, let's say 8 years old, and just bring out this kind of like this childhood genius, really, is what it was. And so I got clear, like I had this scene that where I was really happy and I was playing with some friends. And what I realized that I really loved then, that I really was good at, was inviting people into my magical kind of world that I had created, to play with me and to co-create it together, but inviting them in with a sense of like delight and like let's go play, taking their hand.
Wow.
And I realized like I still like doing that. Or being led by someone else too into their worlds, like I am here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such
Yeah.
a wonderful way of looking at it, because it is like you're inviting people to this magical world of delight where, I
Yeah.
mean, it's not like you're letting go of discomfort completely, but you're learning to be with
Sure.
it and embrace it totally.
Yeah. And this podcast is a great example of that. Like we get to come and play together like little kids, right?
Right. Yeah. And
um,
see what comes up. Yeah.
yeah. So there's plenty of uncertainty here, I'm sure, for both of us, but it also can be delightful and playful.
Yeah. Well, it has been delightful, Leo. So thank you for joining me. Um,
Yeah.
and before we wrap up, where can people find you and how can they work with you in embracing uncertainty?
Yeah, well, I'm right here. You can find me. No, my main website is Zen Habits. So zenhabits.net. I did eventually buy the .com, by the way,
Oh, I didn't know that.
but it redirects, I think, to the .net.
Yeah. Yeah.
So zenhabits.net is my website. That's where I have my weekly writings, and then you can also check out different programs that I have for changing habits or working with this uncertainty training on that page.
Awesome. And I'll include links to all those in the show notes for this episode so you can find
Awesome.
them there
Thank you.
too. So thank you, Leo, and thank you everyone for listening. Until next time, may you be guided by your light.